Second time's a charm. Forgot to hit the live button, but we're here now. Welcome back to Tuesdays with Dr. Susan. We are going to be continuing our chat about eligibility, going over all the disability categories, their definitions, and what that means for you. I'm going to go ahead and run the intro, and we'll bring Dr. Susan on, and we'll get started because we got a lot of information to cover. So, I got to push buttons. There we go. Hi, I'm Nicole, and as you have probably guessed, I have ADHD. I live and breathe all things ADHD in my personal, family, and professional life. I have a background in psychology and special education, and I've gained a lot of knowledge over the years about ADHD, what it really is, how it touches every aspect of your life and the life of your child, as well as a wealth of information and strategies for living with ADHD and parenting kids with ADHD. In this community, we share stories, we learn together, and we support each other as we navigate all things ADHD. Welcome. Hello, friend.
Hello, friend. How are you this week?
Oh, we're plugging along. It's busy time of year, but it's good.
Good. I'm glad to hear that you're doing well and that the referrals keep rolling in.
It's busy and all. We got marching band starting up next week, and I managed to get myself on the boosters as a fundraising chair. So, yeah.
Good. Well, they can use your help.
The band mom life is in full force.
I absolutely am in awe and bowing to you for the energy it takes for you to do that year after year. I couldn't manage it.
Well, I like to be where my kids are. I like to watch them doing the things that makes them happy. And if I'm going to be there, I might as well be useful. So
that works.
There we go.
Definitely. My kids are way past that stage now into adulthood. And now we're just working on keeping everybody employed and alive and planning vacations. In a couple of weeks, my kids and husband and my son's partner are going to the Hogwarts experience at Universal Studios in Florida.
Oh, I want to go there.
Yes, it is my daughter's 30th birthday present.
Oh my gosh, that's
that
wild.
Is her autism special interest is Harry Potter, and she is taking her dolls with her American Girl doll, bringing all the costumes we've purchased. She made her own Quidditch broom for her dolls. So
that's awesome.
She's fully dressed for Quidditch. She
Excellent.
has her class robes. My daughter is a Ravenclaw.
Woohoo! Ravenclaw. I'm a Ravenclaw.
I'm a Gryffindor. We're doing the whole experience. She's getting very excited, planning ahead for that in a couple of weeks.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited for her.
Yeah. Good time of year to go, too. It's not insanely hot yet.
And it's before the end of school, so it shouldn't be quite so jam-packed with kids.
Yeah.
It'll be busy, but not jam-packed is our hope.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's jump into things. We're continuing talking about eligibility. So we went through kind of the testing process and what those results might kind of look like and walk people through that a little bit. So the next, after they show you kind of all your results, then we're going to talk about different disability categories.
Yes.
And whether or not you're eligible in a particular category. So do you have any kind of basic info you want to share first, or should we just jump into categories?
So I have a huge list here. But before we talk about the 13 categories that IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, talk about for an IEP, and that's for kids aged 3 through 21, I want to talk about kids age 0 to 3 and then kids age 3 to 9. There's a special category for those kids that I just want to briefly talk about because it does affect many, many kids. And that's developmental delay. So kids age 0 to 3 can be, in addition to all the other categories we do talk about, can be defined as kids who experience developmental delay. And that's measured by appropriate diagnostic instruments, all the rules we talked about, assessments with age-appropriate assessments for infants and toddlers. And they can have delays in cognitive development, physical development, communication, social, emotional, or adaptive development, which basically means are they doing the things that are age appropriate for 0 to 3? And if they're determined to have a developmental delay that is not up to what a normal, 1, 2, or 3-year-old should be, they also qualify for services without having to have one of the specific disability labels. Now, what's really special about IDEA is they say that this rule of developmental delay can also be given to children aged 3 to 9, but states can limit that. For example, in Colorado, when it first came out, it was 3 to 6, and then it was expanded to 3 to 8. So you have to know.
Yeah, in Utah, I believe it's still 8.
It's 8. So it actually goes through your 9th birthday. So that's why the law says 3 to 9. So till your 9th birthday is what federal law says. And so rather than what helps here for kids, for example, with sensory processing disorder or general learning difficulties who don't necessarily meet the strict criteria for the 13 eligibility categories we're going to talk about in a few moments, they can still be given coverage under an IEP if they meet the criteria for what's called developmental delay. And so parents need to be aware of this because some school districts will kind of slide you out of the category of qualifying for an IEP. And yet, if they have developmental delays, let's define that term, it means not living up to or not performing up to what's considered age appropriate of their chronological age. Again, I'll say it: physical development, cognitive development, communication, social or emotional. This includes all these behavioral difficulties we've discussed at length in this podcast for the last 4 months, and adaptive development. And that means that they're not behaving in day-to-day life up to
so adaptive behavior is going to be what we usually refer to as like daily living skills. So being able to get themselves dressed, brush their teeth. As they get older, things like use public transportation. Yeah. So obviously, at the age of 3, it's going to be different what is typical adaptive development than it will be at like age 6. So if they're age 3 and they're struggling with potty training, it might not be a delay. But if they're 7 and they're still struggling with potty training, now we're talking about a developmental delay.
So my daughter became daytime trained at 4, which is considered delayed, but she wasn't nighttime trained until she was 8. Now, that doesn't affect her ability to attend school.
Right.
But if she wasn't daytime trained, as many of our kids aren't, that's considered a developmental delay and needs to be taken into account. So, for example, a school can't say, you can't come to our school because you're not potty trained, right? They have to
Right.
say, we'll provide support. Somebody to change your diapers, somebody to take your kid to the bathroom, and so
And
on.
oftentimes a goal on their IEP of
Teaching them.
toileting. So,
Right.
if you don't have to just continue to struggle on your own at home, you can
Right.
have them help at
So
school with potty training. I did a
parents
lot of
need
that
to
when I worked
know
in the developmental
that
kindergarten.
public schools still have to address these issues. They
Right.
can't kick your kid out because they're not toilet trained. They can't feed themselves. They can't take care of dirty clothes and so on. Your school needs to address these issues according to federal law. And so I always want to start this eligibility discussion telling you that these issues of developmental delay are very important that you know about, and that these can make your child eligible for an IEP under the category of developmental delay. And that is a legitimate category in order to qualify your child.
We would use that category often because some of the disability categories, it's difficult to qualify when you're young because there's not as much of a gap between what they should be able to do and what they can do. And so we would say, well, we don't know exactly what the disability is, but we know that there's this delay, and so we're going to provide services in this point. Now that label, as we said, can't exist beyond the age of 8. So depending on, you'll have to have a reevaluation at that time to determine eligibility. And at that point, usually, either they have caught up and they are, no longer have some delays, like they've made a lot of progress and they no longer require those services, or they will fit into one of these other disability categories.
Exactly.
So when we talk about kind of evaluation, we'll talk more about evaluation later. They're required to do a reevaluation every 3 years. But if your kid qualified at age 7 and they were under developmental delay, they're going to have to do that reevaluation sooner because they can't maintain that
Category.
disability label. Yeah.
Right.
Beyond that.
And this has been very helpful for younger kids who haven't yet received an autism diagnosis, but are clearly showing behaviors that are impacting their ability to access their education. And
Yeah,
if you
and
don't know
that
that
can be
phrase,
common with some of the higher level, those level 1 autism kids, is that they may not meet criteria for autism if they're tested at age 5.
educational criteria,
Well, even diagnostic criteria.
Well,
they might not when they're younger.
it could be iffy because
Yeah,
you're
they
supposed
might
to
be
meet the
they might be
criteria
more
by the age of 8.
borderline when they're younger, and then, we see it a lot with what they used to be labeled Asperger's, because some of those level 1 kids don't have the language delay that would, make that autism diagnosis more apparent.
Remember,
So,
Asperger's hasn't been used in
yes, that's why I
12
said what
years.
we formerly would
Right.
call Asperger's
So
is
there's very few kids.
included in that level 1 autism category. So
So
that's when, this developmental delay can get the kids some services
exactly.
before they may meet criteria either for the educational category or for a diagnostic criteria of autism.
Exactly.
2 different things, which we'll explain more in a minute.
So what's really important here is that if they're saying your kid doesn't meet a category, you can say, but does my child meet the criteria of developmental delay in one of these 5 areas? And they'll say, well, actually they do. And you say, ding, 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 I meet the criteria for an IEP.
Right.
Okay. And so that's very important for parents to know. And that's why I wanted to bring it up first, because, schools, especially if your kid is coming into a school at at 5 or 6 or 7 that schools will overlook this, and yet your child can still qualify and deserve, this is really important, and deserve the support that they can receive at that age under this category, while further assessment and further testing of services to see what can help your child can be done by the school. Very important.
Absolutely. The other kind of general thing I would bring up is qualifying for special ed is kind of is the door open, is the door closed sort of thing. So once you qualify in any category, that door is open to all services. So just because your kid, if your kid doesn't have a disability in math, but they have a disability in reading and they're struggling a little bit in math, because reading is involved in math, right? We've got language, we've got word problems, we've got things like that. They all impact each other. Once that door is open, they have access to any services they need. It isn't like if you have dyslexia, you get this service, this service, this service. If you have this, you get this, this, and this, right? It is, once that door is open, you get what your kid needs.
The same with autism. If your child qualifies in autism, you get services in reading and math too. And it's what's really important here is it's a door closed, door wide open.
Right.
Now, some states, and there's been recent regulation about this, some states, in fact, many states, have a restriction if at age 3 or 5, when you go into the public school system at age 5, you previously only had an IEP in speech and language. It doesn't open doors to other services once you reach public school at age 5. And in fact, there has been recent regulation from the Federal Office of Special Education. And remember, all these rules are still in effect right now, regardless of whatever political turmoil is going on. These rules have not yet changed. So the recent regulation says, we're not allowing that anymore. We're no longer allowing schools to shut down access to other services if your kid had a strictly speech language IEP. That is a false dichotomy that school districts were doing. And so if you had what was a speech language IEP from ages 3 to 5, and at 5, your kid gets into public school and is having difficulty with reading and math and so on, find an advocate and get them to inform your school district that these new regulations have come out and your child must be assessed for reading, math, autism, behavioral issues. So in other words, the full eligibility eval that Nicole and I discussed at length 2 weeks ago. And
so does that also apply to like the articulation speech only kids in elementary school?
That's what I'm talking about. Kids who have only speech language designated IEPs.
But I'm talking like over the age of 5, like if they're in second grade.
Kids who were limited to what some states called, we're only giving you speech services, nothing else. They had a rule about that, and you only got speech language, and they were automatically excluded from all other services. That's no longer allowed.
Okay.
You have to evaluate them for all services. I'll find.
But can they then receive like a speech only IEP if they're not struggling in other academic areas?
What the Office of Special Education is now saying is you can't artificially stop them from receiving other services. There have been cases, many cases in the 40 years I've been doing this, in which schools said, too bad, you're a speech language kid and we're not going to serve you in any other area. And they're saying that actually has never been true. States can't do that. We're going to follow up on states that are doing that. So you always are allowed. So let's talk about what those categories are.
Yeah.
I have a list
Okay.
From the federal government. And so the first category that beside once we get past the developmental delay, there are 13 eligibility categories. And those categories, some of them have multiple things in them, but there are
Yes.
13 categories. The first category is autism, which means a developmental delay I'm reading from the law, significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction, generally evident before age 3, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Now, this is an important definition because your child can have a medical diagnosis of autism, and the school can say your child does not meet the educational diagnosis because it doesn't, here's the phrase, you heard me say it a few minutes ago, it doesn't adversely affect their educational performance. Now,
Right. So that's going back to that 3-prong test, right? Do they
right,
have a disability? Does it affect their educational performance? Do they require specialized
special
instruction?
education.
So,
So now we deal with that question, as we've discussed here many times, that if you have a child who has level 1 or even level 2, if they're of normal or higher intelligence, right, having autism, many of those kids can get B's and C's in public education, and the school may say that kid is not impacted by their autism. And we can say they might, but they might have extreme executive function, anxiety issues. I mean, anxiety issues. They come home and they fall apart because they've held it together at school and they're not doing well at home. Or they may even be of profound intelligence. It's very common. About 60% of these level 1 kids are of high intelligence. They can be getting A's and A pluses, and they're getting B's and C's because of the impact of their autism. So we have to be very careful with this definition of what is adversely affecting their educational performance. And we have to make sure that the school looks at not just grades, as you've heard us say here many, many times.
well, and not just in, traditional academic areas.
Right.
Because if you look at the core curriculum, that each state comes up with their own core curriculum, but included in there is social, emotional, behavioral, adaptive behavior standards that the school is teaching to your kids, right? You got social, emotional learning, things like that. And those are the areas where our kids are going to be impacted. It's in
So
that
we're
executive
looking at
functioning,
social skills. We're looking at, are they developing friendships? Are they able to
communication.
participate through communicating and advocating for their needs? Are they being bullied because they're not able to? Remember, we said before, are they developmentally delayed in their social relationships because they might be in 11th grade, but their social relationships look like an elementary school kid? And so we're looking
And
at
a lot of the
the whole
kids will
picture.
have emotional and behavioral issues that, they're dealing with meltdowns, they're dealing with sensory issues that are impacting their education,
So they
even
must
if
look at the
they
whole.
are, above grade level in reading and math.
Exactly. So they have to look at the whole picture
Right.
before they say that the autism is not impacting their ability to access their education. So the list goes on in alphabetical order. So the next,
I just want
oh
to
yeah,
add right here, it's important for you to know that the school is not giving a medical diagnosis of autism. They are doing it is an educational classification of autism, and it is not the same thing. So you're not going to be able to take your assessment that you did at the school and go get, your insurance is not going to be like, oh, okay, he's got autism, we're going to give you all these services, right? They are separate things. And just because your child has a medical diagnosis of autism, like we said, doesn't necessarily mean that they would qualify under the category of autism. There might be another disability category that fits their educational needs better as well.
right. I'm so glad you said that about the insurance, because what I was going to say is having a medical diagnosis helps you get the school to evaluate. They're more likely to
Yes.
evaluate if
And
you
it
have a
can help
medical diagnosis.
with part of that eligibility process. If you have, a report from a psychologist that says, look, they're diagnosed with autism, it can help them in that process because they can use that as a piece of information in their evaluation.
But the teachers who are going to complete the report instruments that say, is this child's autism impacting the kid in the classroom, are not the same as the assessment instruments that a neuropsychological evaluation will use. So be prepared to get different results.
Yes, and they use different measures. Sometimes the schools will use an ADOS, but not always. They have different.
Many school districts, the school district itself, the in-school assessment will not. If a school district has a neuropsychologist,
they have a school psychologist that will do it.
You
that
can
has been
request
trained in the
that.
ADOS.
I want to be really clear how rare
Right.
that would be. Yeah, I don't want to go there. That's above and beyond.
Well,
So
the school district I worked in, they would, if we were doing an autism evaluation, they would often send a school psychologist to do an ADOS. So
okay.
I guess it just depends on where you are, how frequently that
that's
happens,
very
but
unusual.
don't expect it.
Yeah, even here in Colorado, I can only get that done in a few of our 62 school districts. All right, so the next two are strictly physical diagnoses. Number 2 is deaf blindness, in which there are simultaneous hearing and visual impairments that cause such severe communication and other developmental and educational needs that they cannot be accommodated in special education programs solely for children with deafness or children with blindness. So both disabilities have to be to the level of a disability that would impact their ability to access their education. So you can't send the kid. This is what's interesting. Of course, we all think about Helen Keller. For example, in Colorado, we have schools for the deaf and we have schools for the blind, but there isn't a school specifically just for kids who have deaf blindness. They have to be specially accommodated. And number 3 is deafness. That's so severe that a child is impaired in processing linguistic information in hearing with or without amplification. So this child could participate in a typical classroom with amplification or an interpreter, or could be assigned to a special classroom for the deaf. Number 4, again, these are only in alphabetical order, not in order of the severity of the disability.
Right.
Number 4 is emotional disturbance, which is a very controversial category, I will tell you.
It's a stupid label.
I
always hated. It used to be BD, right? Behavioral disorder.
Disturbance, right.
And then it was E/BD.
It's been emotional disturbance for 20 years now.
I know, but I was teaching when they made the change, and I was like, this is a stupid change, especially because I was working in a BD classroom, so a lot of our kids had this category.
It's really hard. A child has to show one or more of the following characteristics that adversely affects the child's ability to access their education: an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. So sensory to here means deaf or blindness, right? Or a medical condition, or cognitive inability to learn. An inability to build or maintain interpersonal relationships with peers or teachers, inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under quote unquote normal circumstances, or a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. And the term includes schizophrenia. It also could include severe anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder. In other words, mental illness.
Right. So,
it does not, by the way, include autism. Want to be very clear that this, however, many schools where a child does not receive an autism diagnosis attempt to put children in this category when the autistic child might have a medical diagnosis of autism, but does not have a school or educational diagnosis of autism, but they have severe behavioral, sensory, or emotional outbursts or behaviors.
Yeah.
This is why it's
I had a kid who was, well, and it's controversial because it has the name emotionally disturbed in it, right? As opposed to a disability, emotional behavioral disorder, emotional behavior disability. That emotional disturbance is it's not a parents don't like that label, and
No,
I don't
not at
blame
all.
them because like my kid is not emotionally disturbed, right? Like it
No.
has a very like put them in the psych ward
And
kind
as
of
I
connotation
said,
to it, and I hate it.
It really should be a mental illness category, but they try to see kids with autism under it, and it really
Well, I mean,
doesn't
my
fit.
son that has autism was previously categorized as ED because he, you know, while there were definite signs of autism when he was younger, his like the gap in his development really didn't show up as significant until he was 8.
Older. Yeah.
Earlier than that, we knew he had ADHD. We knew that there was some oppositional defiance, and we like that there was a lot of behavioral issues, that he had some sensory stuff, but it could have been ADHD sensory stuff, you know, like he had a slight language delay, but he caught up before he was 3. So like he didn't meet criteria until as he got older, and the, you know, other kids are developing at a faster rate, then that gap in development became more clear and autism became a more appropriate category. So sometimes at the time that might be the category that they fit best in. Right.
And it's kind of like the
that's
development.
why they do reevaluations, is to make sure that this is still the correct label.
Exactly. But that's why it's such a controversial category.
Yes,
because for many parents
it feels kind of like and it can feel like a catch-all. Like they're struggling with something. We don't exactly know what it is. We know that they're really struggling with behavior. We've tried a behavior intervention plan. It's not enough. They need more support than we're able to give them on a 504 or a behavior intervention plan. So we know they need support. And we can qualify them here because, you know, they're meeting clinical significance in certain behavior areas on a BASC. And so they're putting them there. So while, you know, it's not always the best, most accurate label for every kid all the time, it is useful in the fact that if your kid is struggling and they can't get them qualified in another category, but they can qualify them here, great. Doors open, you get the services.
This category has also been consistently misused at the intersectionality of race and disability.
Yes.
And so a lot of kids who are non-white, Hispanic and Black kids particularly, are placed in this category rather than doing sufficient assessment.
And appropriate for their, you know,
cultural needs.
Yeah, culturally appropriate assessments.
They're not being appropriately placed in the categories where they belong because they're being mislabeled for their behavior based on their racial profile. And that makes this category extremely controversial as well. There's a great deal of research.
And it can cause some issues, you know, because when we get to, you know, services and placement, we'll talk more about this. But a lot of times, once that kid has that EBD label,
hard to move.
They will automatically try and just stick them into a self-contained behavior classroom, which I have
Let's
feelings
not get
on both
sidetracked.
sides. I
We're,
know.
we're only up to
On
number
those
4 out of
classrooms because I
13.
have a lot of different experiences
Yeah,
with them, but
right. But let's not
it's
get
just something to
sidetracked.
be aware of. I know
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yes, you are.
Oh, only a little bit.
Okay, I'll
I'm
give you
not
that.
going all the
So
way down the
number
rabbit
5,
hole.
number 5 is hearing impairment. And so I want us to be very clear. We have deaf and deaf blindness, but we also have hearing impairment, which is a milder level of hearing impairment, but it does require accommodation and support and can qualify a child for IEP services. So we want to be clear, there's the most severe level of deafness, and there's also hearing impairment as a secondary level of disability that can qualify a child for an IEP. Number
Well, and
6,
just
yeah, go ahead.
adding right there, there are also hearing impaired kids that don't require special ed, right? That just require
Right, just
accommodations in the
require,
classroom.
well, they have an
So
accommodation of a
it's a
hearing
matter of,
aid or a
again, that
cochlear implant.
educational impact and do they require specialized instructions? If they
Right,
just need accommodations, they need the teacher to wear a speaker or they, things like that. Those are accommodations that could be put on a 504.
right. But there's other kids where, I guess what we want to point out is there's levels of intervention that can
Yes.
go along with hearing impairment up through deafness as defined by the law. Intellectual disability is category number 6, and this means significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning existing concurrently with deficits in adaptive behavior manifested during the developmental period impacts their ability to access education. So,
Mhm.
by federal law, this means an IQ under 70, which is the bottom 2% of the bell curve that we've talked about before, and also adaptive behavior under
Yes.
70 on the bell curve that we've talked about before. And so this generally requires significant help, excuse me,
Yeah,
both academically
oftentimes,
and behaviorally.
self-contained classrooms, a different sort of educational plan where, they are not necessarily on the same academic track, right? We're working more on that adaptive behavior, those daily living skills
Well,
and
I want to be
job
clear.
skills and things. Not
I would not
always,
say,
but
yeah, I would say
sometimes.
kids in that, 60 to 70 IQ who have good adaptive behaviors can function in an inclusive classroom with modified curriculum and with one-on-one support are perfectly capable of being in the inclusive classroom. Yes, there's often a need for more profoundly affected individuals to be in a separate classroom, but I do not agree that that should be the automatic placement for these
No, there
kids.
should never be an automatic placement based on what your
Right.
disability category is.
So
It should
many
all
of
be
my
individually
many of my friends and
determined.
colleagues who have kids with Down syndrome, which is a frequent cause of intellectual disability, or Fragile X, which is a frequent cause of intellectual disability, have successfully had their kids in
Yes.
neurotypical classrooms with appropriate supports and modifications. And those kids have been
Yes.
successful in K-12 school and do not require separate classrooms. And so that is not what I would consider least restrictive environment for a
No.
great number of these kids. Now, schools, it makes it easier for schools to compartmentalize those kids and shove them away, but that is not what I would recommend to families. If your kid is able to participate, wants to be around peers, wants to be around their neighborhood kids, that is what I would push parents to do. I'm very
Sure. And
strong
again,
about
it's going to be a case by case basis. There's a reason why, those other types of placements exist, and it might be a better place for your kid. It might not. Sometimes being in that classroom where they can slow down their academics and teach more on their level the entire day is the right option. And sometimes it is, a full inclusion with supports in the classroom. Sometimes it's a, self-contained resource where they spend half the day in the resource classroom getting instruction on their level and half the day in a general ed classroom with their peers. Those decisions should always be made on a case-by-case basis. But just because it's a self-contained classroom doesn't mean it's necessarily, discriminatory or that they're shoving your kid aside, right? There are a variety of placements so that they can meet a variety of needs. So you make the decision with the team. And if you really want your kid to be in a general ed classroom, then absolutely push for that. But don't, I wouldn't also automatically shut the door on a different program because it might better meet the needs of your kid.
Right. What meets the needs of your kid is what you, the parent, and the team who's done the assessment feel is the best place to further their education.
Right, so to meet their goals, whatever their individual goals might be.
Exactly.
And sometimes those are going to be more academic, and sometimes those are going to be more social, and sometimes they're going to be more adaptive behavior. And depending on what that next goal is for your kid is what's going to determine where they should receive those services. And we'll talk about that when we get to placement.
Yep. And this decision is even harder for category number 7, which is multiple disabilities. And multiple disabilities means you have intellectual disability plus a physical disability of some kind. That could be blindness, deafness, cerebral palsy, some other kind of orthopedic impairment. And so you're dealing with, and it could be some other kind of health condition such as diabetes, asthma. It can be ADHD,
traumatic brain injury.
It could be autism. Autism and Down syndrome has an organization of its own now because we've discovered how much more common it was than we used to. People just assumed people with Down syndrome didn't have other diagnoses, but now we've learned autism is very common in the Down syndrome population. Cerebral palsy and autism is a common combination now, we've learned. And so when we have multiple disabilities and you have to make multiple layers of instruction and accommodation, again, many school districts find what they call significant special needs or what they call adaptive behavior rooms are easier. This is easier in richer school districts where they have resources to do this. Rural school districts may have seen one of these kinds of kids in 10 or 15 years. And so they don't have the resources, but this is a separate category that makes your child eligible for an IEP and requires the school district to bring in the resources to serve your child, regardless.
And that can include the medical needs that, nurses and medication and feeding tubes and all of those sorts of respiratory support, all of that.
Right. So I have a client now in a rural community in Montana who has both oxygen needs and a G tube, a feeding tube. They want the kid to come into the high school level. And we say a nurse has to be on the on the premises at the time because we can't train a teacher to deal with the G. What if the G tube pulls out? This kid can be violent. He literally can throw his oxygen tank at somebody.
And that's not great.
If he has severe autism, cerebral palsy, he falls under this category. And they're fighting. He's only going to be in the school for an hour a week. He's been doing homebound because of his medical conditions. They want him to transition into being in the school. And we say, fine, then you have to have a nurse. But they only have a nurse for multiple schools. Well, we say for the 1 hour a week he's there, your nurse
needs to be there
at that school. And this is now where we are negotiating. And so the needs of children like this, a school district must address the health needs as well.
It can be very complex,
needs, as well as the intellectual and cognitive needs, academic needs of a child like this.
And so, there is a separate, when you're talking about special ed teacher, there is a separate license for what they call severe. So there's mild, moderate disability and severe disability. And those who have that, I was a mild, moderate teacher, but those who have that severe license are trained in a lot more of those types of medical needs and behavioral needs. And
so you have to be sure a person like that is located in the school where your child is attending.
Right.
So we just want you to know that schools can't say to you, we can't take your child.
We can't do that. Right.
The law says then they have to hire
if someone. They have this disability, they must go there. No.
We have to bring that person.
We do not make placement decisions based solely on disability category. Placement decisions need to be based on IEP goals and where is the best place to meet those goals.
They can't ship you 3 hours across the district. The teacher has to travel to you. So number 8 covers the author, because we're still in alphabetical order.
Oh, real quick, I would add to that transportation. If your child has, severe if they are in a wheelchair, that sort of thing, the school's required to transport your kid to and from school. So
orthopedic impairment. An orthopedic impairment that, here's the phrase, every single one, adversely impacts a child's educational performance. So it could be a congenital anomaly, spina bifida, cerebral palsy, impairments caused by disease such as poliomyelitis, tuberculosis, and impairments from other causes such as cerebral palsy, amputations, fractures, or burns. And so any physical disease that causes an orthopedic impairment, that means their mobility is impaired, and the school is required to take that into account. And so, for example, we had a school where the elementary school was on the first floor and the middle school was on the second floor. No elevator, kid in a wheelchair.
No elevator?
No elevator
like that anymore. Holy cow.
Whole building. And so they had to rearrange things. So some classes were upstairs, some classes were downstairs, and the kid could be graduated to middle school.
Well, and again, this is another one of those times where there's going to be a determination of, is this a special education? They require, specialized instruction. It's having an educational impact, or is this just a physical access problem? If it's a physical access problem, then that's an accommodation that can be done on a 504. If they require that specialized instruction, then
the kid needed an IEP for a great many reasons.
Sure.
But one of the issues is the middle school was on the second floor.
Yeah, I'm just pointing out that, if your kid is in a wheelchair or struggles with walking and they may not qualify for an IEP because all they need is accommodations for them to be able to access the classroom. However, if your kid needs physical therapy at school and those sorts of services, that can be done on an IEP.
Right. So I thought this was a great one. They were just flabbergasted. And so over the following summer, they built an elevator in the school.
Yeah. I'm shocked they hadn't had to do that already. That's
no, me too.
Basic ADA stuff here. You are a public building. You got to have ramps and an elevator, people. We're in 2025.
Well, this was probably 10 years ago or more.
Still, ADA has been around for 25
years. Yep. It was great. This one was great. Anyway, so number 9 is a very big one. This is going to take a lot of discussion. A lot of you have other health impairment as the eligibility designation on your IEPs. Let's discuss this at some length because it's actually quite complex.
Yes.
Other health impairment means having limited strength, vitality, or alertness, including heightened alertness to environmental stimuli that results in limited alertness to educational environment. Now, we all know what that sounds like. Do you want to say it for me, Nicole?
Nicole has what?
ADHD. this is interesting. There is no ADHD category, everybody. This
Nope.
is the primary category for anyone who has ADHD as one of their qualifying criteria. And you
If
can
they
see it
don't
just in the
meet
definition,
another disability category.
right?
Because if you have ADHD and you also have dyslexia, then you've got a specific learning disability, right? So
We'll
that
do
might
that.
be the
We're
more
not in
appropriate
alphabetical order.
category.
That one's next.
Yes, I know.
So if
That one we might need to,
but
I
there
don't
are
know.
multiple things that can meet this criteria. So again, limited physical strength, so that's body weakness, vitality, and that means energy, your stamina, you can't get through your day, or alertness, and that's attention. And that can be due to chronic or acute health problems, including asthma, ADHD, diabetes, epilepsy, heart condition, hemophilia, lead poisoning, leukemia, nephritis, which is a kidney disease, rheumatic fever, sickle cell anemia, and Tourette's syndrome. Okay, so there's a long list.
Other health impairment, the requirement is that you have a medical condition that is impacting your educational performance.
Exactly.
So that is where ADHD falls in, but you have to have that diagnosis. So the school's not going to look at your thing and be like, well, you are limited in attention. If you don't have a letter from the doctor, you can't qualify for it. They require documentation of that medical diagnosis as part of the eligibility criteria. So,
Exactly.
but that's, so any of those medical conditions, right? Diabetes, all of those things, if it's going to require, again, specialized instruction and it's impacting your educational performance.
Right. Okay, so even though we all immediately know this is where they put ADHD, there's actually a dozen medical diagnoses that fall under this.
Oh yeah, I had kids with diabetes who were under this category.
Asthma.
That was a very common one.
Now we
I
do
don't think I ever
POTS.
had any asthma kids, but POTS would be a good one.
It's very common. I'm on my 5th or 6th client with POTS now.
Yeah.
And that falls under this category as well.
Yeah. But again, you have to have that medical diagnosis. So while, we've talked during that assessment process, right, of let the school do some of the testing and then take that testing over to a neuropsychologist and have them fill it in, right? But if you're getting to the point where it's like, it's not looking like they're going to qualify under another category, but like the BASC is coming clinically significant in attention, right? There's signs there. The school's not going to diagnose ADHD. They might say, have they ever been diagnosed with ADHD? Because if they have a medical diagnosis, then they might qualify under this, right? They're not going to tell you to go do it, but they may ask questions like that. And at that point, you can even just go to your pediatrician with the information that the school's given you if you can't get in with a psychologist in a timely manner, because that can sometimes take some time. But if you do have that medical diagnosis already, absolutely, your doctor will write you a letter and it gets handled.
Right. So I know we only have a few minutes, but let's handle specific learning disability, which is another complex one. It means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written. All right. Once again, it's about language, spoken or written, and it manifests in the imperfect ability, I'm reading you the law, to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. It's a lot of disabilities covered under this. And so when you talk about learning disability, I'm going to say them again: listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do math. And so even though the schools may call them specific learning disability in reading, in writing, or in math, that puts it down in 3 categories. It actually covers these 7 categories: listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or math. So it's the school says 3 categories. There's actually 7 abilities covered under the law, and the law, federal law says you can call them dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia.
Yeah.
They're the same thing as learning disability in reading, writing, and math. And schools get pissy about the names, but the law says you have to use either name interchangeable. But they cover 7 types of skills that your child might have difficulty with. And you can see the overlap. Disability in listening or thinking could be impacted by ADHD or autism.
Right.
And you could have ADHD and still have a learning disability in speaking, listening, or thinking at the same time.
And it gets, so I don't know, we might have to have a whole hour on
Just on this one.
because so let's skip
Let's
this
go
one
through
and
the last 2 just to
and then
finish the categories. And I agree with you. Maybe
I think next
time,
week we talk about
the learning
eligibility for learning disabilities, because it's very complicated. There's multiple paths to eligibility and what it looks like in the
Let's
testing.
dig
And
in.
so
So
we'll
the
want to
next
dig into
one
that a
is
little bit.
speech language. And speech language means a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, or a language impairment or voice impairment. And so speech language has to do with, can you pronounce the words? Excuse me, can you say all the letters and sounds? Or if the language impairment is both expressive and receptive language. Can you express your needs through speaking, and can you understand the needs through listening?
Yeah. So
And
I've got kind of a list here of different areas in speech language impaired. So you've got expressive language, right? How can you get your thoughts out through communication? Receptive language, can you understand what's coming at you? Syntax, so are you using the right words when you're speaking? Semantics is, putting sentences and paragraphs together. Morphology is word structure, phrases, grammar kinds of things. Phonology is going to be the use of speech sounds. So that's going to be more your like articulation. Pragmatic language has to do with social communication and conversational speech. And then fluency, which is where kind of your stuttering or other types of disfluency might show up.
Perfect. And then our last category, just to keep us in our hour time, we started a couple of minutes late, is a traumatic brain injury. Also can make you eligible for special education services. And this is an acquired injury to the brain caused by an external physical force, resulting in total or partial functional disability, meaning being able to use your body, or psychosocial impairment, meaning in your brain, or both. Again, that adversely affects your ability to impact your education. What's really important here, just like we talked about in autism, is that it's not just about your grades, but it's psychosocial. So that means your relationships with others, your behavior, your ability.
Well, a lot of times, mild traumatic brain injuries can cause issues with like stamina, like we talked about with other health impaired, like your ability to attend for a long period of time. You get cognitive fatigue. It can impact your executive functioning, and it can be you might be fine in one area and not in another. Traumatic brain injury is complex.
Yeah, the law is even more specific than that, Nicole. I'm sorry to interrupt. It says impairments or one or more areas such as cognition, language, memory, attention, reasoning, abstract thinking, judgment, problem solving, sensory, perceptual and motor abilities, psychosocial behavior, that's the relationship piece, physical functions, information processing. So that means how fast or slow you process what's happening, and speech. So
and I think one of the thing is that a lot of people who aren't familiar with this world think of traumatic brain injury and think of people who are severely disabled from a traumatic brain injury, right? But a traumatic brain injury can come from a mild concussion.
Correct.
It's a matter of what kind of impact, like where it happens in the brain, what kinds of processes are interrupted. So even if your kid is playing football and gets a mild concussion and they don't seem to be able to recover. Yeah, ice hockey, where you are. We got a lot of football and soccer. The number one concussion sport is soccer. Number two is, do you know?
I assumed it was football and then ice hockey.
Cheerleading.
Oh, they drop them.
They get dropped. The flyers get dropped on their heads and the bases get kicked.
Oh my God.
Cheerleading is number two.
So my son had a concussion from ice hockey. He was out of school for 6 weeks. Couldn't even look at his phone.
It takes a lot longer to recover than people think.
And they did neuropsychological testing. He had had testing prior. They did testing right after the concussion. His numbers dropped precipitously. And then he had to do a specialized kind of physical therapy that's just for concussions. And it took him weeks and weeks to recover.
I mean, they've come a long way in brain injury. There's a lot of good neurofeedback and things that they can do to recover from brain injuries, but it takes longer than you would think to recover some of those processes. And if it is then impacting your kid at school, get
he couldn't
help.
Go back to class. He couldn't read.
And then if you're missing 6 months of your education because your brain is still recovering, now this is the point where you might need
these
an IEP.
Kids are eligible for IEP services.
And you may have to fight with the school a little bit for it. I had a family member that
write to us and we'll send
was a cheerleader and got dropped on her head and had a lot of problems afterwards.
He
really had to fight with the school to get her the help she needed.
Now that you say that, there was a cheerleader in the concussion program. There were tennis players and, of course, football players.
Yeah, Greg went to a conference on traumatic brain injury a couple years ago, and he was like, it was when our kids were playing baseball, and baseball was very low on the list. And I was like, see, baseball's good.
My son went headfirst into the boards.
Yep.
In ice hockey. And
I think it's probably just not as common because not as many kids play hockey. Depending on your area, if hockey is definitely
depends on where you are. So number 13, to wrap us up, I already told this to you, but remember we said there's deafness and then hearing impairment, there's blindness, and there's also visual
impairment.
Doing this alphabetically. There's also visual impairment. You can not only ask for accommodations such as large print and so on, but if it impacts your ability to learn, then you can get special education to assist in your learning if your visual impairment impacts your ability to learn, which it can, not just requiring accommodations, but it can require specialized instruction if it impacts your understanding of the material, for example.
Right. So next week, we will do a deep dive into specific learning disabilities. We'll talk about the different ways that you can be found eligible because there are multiple paths to eligibility and how they determine whether or not you have a specific learning disability.
It's getting dark where I'm sitting.
And it changes. It's something that's been in flux. You know, when I was first training, we were full in the discrepancy model, and then we were transitioning into response to intervention only, and now we have kind of multiple paths, which I think is better because
actually it was illegal to do response to intervention only. It's always been illegal to do response to intervention only. Utah might have done that.
Yeah, well, they were
illegal.
They were definitely pushing RTI.
Yes,
and
that's
true.
You know, that,
I mean, when I first started, we had the disability, like the discrepancy disc.
That was
calculator.
20 years ago, dear.
That's when I was first training, my friend. I graduated in 2002.
When I graduated 45 years ago, it was discrepancy model, but response to intervention only has always been illegal. Always.
Yeah.
Schools
so it's this mixed model of,
been illegal.
Of how that qualification, and it is complicated.
Yeah.
And it is complicated for me to understand. So
stuck with us in this lengthy session today, I really hope you found it useful, because people don't realize how broad federal law really is.
Yes.
School districts, especially poorer states, really want to restrict the number of categories that can get services. And our intention today is to tell you your child qualifies for services. Stand up for your child's rights. Reach out to us for help getting an advocate if your school district is trying to restrict your child's access, because the law is still the law, and your child deserves the support they need.
And absolutely, if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments here. You can reach out to one of us on a variety of channels. Susan, you want to just quick plug how they can find you?
My website where you can find out more about me and make an appointment is drsusanblumberg.com, or just make an appointment with me. Call coachsusan.com.
And those links are in the description of the video, so you can click there. You can reach out to me on either by commenting here, or Instagram is a good way to find me. I'm Nicole Has ADHD there. I respond to direct messages there pretty quickly. And we would be happy to answer any questions you might have. If you don't want to put that question publicly in a comment, you can absolutely send it to us privately, and we can address those questions next time. So if you have any questions about specific learning disabilities, since that's what we're going to be talking about next week, absolutely send those to us.
We'll be happy to answer them. Bye.
I'm going to go check and see if we have a verdict in Lori Vallow. So,
okay.
Have a great week.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This video is not a substitute for counseling, psychotherapy, medical, or mental health care. The information and advice shared here should not be used in place of any form of diagnosis, treatment, or therapy. Information provided here does not involve diagnosis or treatment of medical or mental or psychological disorders. If you feel the need for professional support, please seek a local professional in your area. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only.